इससे आगे पीछे हो, इससे आगे पीछे हो, पीछे। औज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम, बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम। I, Dr. Khalid Mahmood, take the pleasure to welcome you all in the first lecture of UNESCO Chair Lecture Series 2026 at iccbs University of Karachi. The UNESCO Chair on Medicinal and Bioorganic Natural Product Chemistry is regularly organizing such events throughout the year. This is first of its kind this year. Actually, the UNESCO Chair Network is a program that promotes international inter-university cooperations and networking to enhance the institutional capacities through knowledge sharing and collaborative work. The program supports the establishment of UNESCO chair networks in key priority areas related to the UNESCO fields of competence. Today, more than 170 of the university chairs included in the UNESCO chair program are related to the natural sciences. So the objective of these chairs is to link researchers and practitioners, to promote research and trainings, to arrange teaching programs, and to establish inter-university networks. We, the iccbs, are proud to hold such a chair, the UNESCO chair on organic and natural product chemistry here at iccbs. This chair was established is working since 2020. First proposed in 2018 and established in 2020. Now it is its second term of this UNESCO chair with the leadership of our director, Professor Muhammad Raza Shah. And now I invite to our director, Muhammad Raza Shah, to briefly introduce the UNESCO chair. Thank you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Let me thank our speaker, Dr. Jan Fiard. Thank you so much for visiting us. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure that we are having a young scholar from Germany. So Germany is very close to my heart in many ways because I spent 3 years of my life in Mainz, and I was actually studying in Max Planck Research Institute. I was pursuing my PhD from Max Planck Research Institute in Mainz. You know that the topic of today is vital in many ways. The climate change is actually affecting not only the human life on this earth, but also the aquatic, also the other microorganisms which are essential for our routine activities and for the daily life. So the ecosystems, actually the climate change is affecting the ecosystem of this world. And now it is our responsibility as responsible creature of this universe. You know that the human being is a responsible creature because this is the creature who is taking care of the whole universe. And being a responsible creature of this universe, we will have to take care of our own universe. The rest of, and unfortunately, this responsible creature is also destroying this universe. If you just go back and just study, you will just find that the other creature on this planet, they are not destroying this world so much. Actually, we are making their life miserable. Like we are just polluting the water, which is essential for the aquatic life, and we are endangering their life. Similarly, we are polluting the environment and the air, which is essential for the birds. Uh, and at the same time, due to our activities, we are responsible for the temperature of this globe. And due to that temperature changes, you will experience, and we have experienced recently, last year, a flood in the especially in the northern area, and a couple of days ago there was a heavy rain in the northern area, which affected a large number of not only the population but also the livestock and other system also. So let me also just briefly touch on the UNESCO chair. We are having UNESCO chair on bioorganic, medicinal and natural product chemistry in the iccbs. The core mandate of this UNESCO chair is to just promote the area of especially bioorganic chemistry, bioorganic medicinal chemistry in the world. So under this, we are conducting a large number of programs which include seminars, which includes also internship programs. We conducted last year the largest largest program, internship program of our university and our city, where we just recruited a large number of young researchers there. In addition to that, we are also just offering training to under this program to students from the Africa, and many African students are coming to our institute under this training programs. They are getting training in our laboratory in the cutting edge area of bioorganic medicinal chemistry. We are also offering training to the local communities. Similarly, we have conducted also various kind of workshops, like we conducted a workshop on the role and implication of the atomic force microscopy. So these various kind of workshops are also conducted under the umbrella of the UNESCO chair. So this UNESCO chair is a vibrant one in the world, and it's a one of the most active UNESCO chair you can ever find under this umbrella. The UNESCO has established various chairs in different parts of the world, but our voice is the most prominent one in that, and the simple reason is that we are actively contributing to the goals of the UNESCO, and that's the reason that they are listening to us carefully. And last year we conducted a consortium and a programs where we just gather UNESCO chair through online and also physical activity, and that was one of the first consortium which were established, which were organized by any UNESCO chair who just brought together various UNESCO chair on the same platform, and we deliver lectures, and there were like various topics because the UNESCO have established chairs on various topics which range from the computer science to the biological science, physical science, social sciences, and political science, and so on. So these were all together on the same platform, and we discuss problems which is facing by this beautiful world. And we just agreed on that in that consortium that we will join hand together to make this earth much more beautiful and much more useful for our own population. And that's the reason that we are here today again, that today we will be discussing the climate change and its activity. So I would not take much more time. So once again, thank you so much for visiting us and sparing time. And I wish you a very stimulating stay here in Pakistan, and I'm sure you will find this. This is a beautiful research institute. We are running the largest doctoral program of the country. This is a UNESCO Center of Excellence. This center is unique in the sense that the facilities which I was availing at the next plant, these facilities are better than those facilities. We are having 13 superconducting NMR machine, mass spectrometers, a wide range of facilities are available here. And many German students, we have trained so far 126 German students. So there were frequently German students used to come here and they were getting training in our institutions. This is the only institution in the developing world where several Nobel laureates visited these facilities and they appreciated our research work. And you see, and this is the institution which have won a lot of honors for the country. We are our institution is also providing national services like we have various laboratories which include pesticide analysis laboratory, forensic laboratories, and we have virology centers, we have genome centers, we have plant biotechnology, we have clinical trial, and so on. You just name it. So it's a complex of 17 research center. And every center is having ecosystem. So there is an ecosystem, and they are just aligned with the core mission of the institute. So this is I would just urge you to just visit various facility of the institute, and you will find it a wonderful place to work. And you will also find our students, they are the best and the best in the country because we are just advertising fellow recruitment and we induct the student after a step competition. So all these students which you will be encountering, they are the cream of the Pakistan. So you will enjoy work, just interacting with them. So let me thank you again for visiting and thank you so much.
Now I will be pleased to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Jan Freihardt, a young postdoctoral researcher at ETH Zurich, Chair of International Political Economy and Environmental Politics. Trained as both an engineer and political scientist, he bridges technical and social science to address climate migration, adaptation, disaster risk, communication, and air pollution. He earned his PhD in political science at ETH Zurich in 2023 with the dissertation when the river breaks the land, environmental mobility among the rural household in Bangladesh based on extensive fieldwork. His research has produced 16 peer-reviewed articles, 2 books, datasets, software, and a documentary, Eroding Horizons. Jan has held research position at Columbia University and ETH Zurich Global Health Engineering Group. He is the recipient of the PPE Young Scholar Award 2025 and ETH Career Seed Award 2026. His teaching covers international environmental politics, scientific ethics, and policy feasibility, multilingual and interdisciplinary. He co-founded an organization, remain active in environmental NGOs. He regularly contributes to public debates and the media on climate change and transformative science. Now I welcome Jan Freihardt for his today's lecture.
All right, good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. So good to see so many faces. Many thanks for the warm introductions, Professor Shah for the invitation, Dr. Sana for arranging at such short notice. It's a huge pleasure and honor for me to be here today and share some of my research findings from the context of Bangladesh, and then looking very much forward to discussing what potential implications might be for the case of Pakistan, how much what we found is transferable and how much maybe differs. So just a few words ahead. So I arrived in Pakistan around 3 weeks ago. It's my first visit to the country and I love it. It's a beautiful place. So I'm very happy I came. I spent a few days here in Karachi, then went up to Islamabad, Pindi, and then spent around 10 days in GB, where we actually started a new research project on air pollution monitoring together with the Pakistan Air Quality Initiative and researchers from Karakoram International University in Gilgit. So that's where we did a small pilot study the last 10 days. I just returned from Skardu yesterday, and I'm still very blessed by the mountains. So it's a very beautiful country, and I'll be coming back also in May for another month roughly. So I'm very happy that this all worked out in these geopolitically difficult times. So yeah, but today we decided that I would present and speak more about the topic of my dissertation. So not so much about the air pollution research, but of course, if there's interest in that topic, we can also discuss that later on. But for now, I would then start with basically presenting the research from my dissertation in Bangladesh. So these are just a few introductory words. So let me start with a short motivation. So the dissertation looked at the intersection of climate change and mobility/immobility questions. Why are we doing this? I think it's something that we're all unfortunately very much aware of, that climate change is increasing the frequency as well as the intensity of natural hazards around the world. So here's just some examples. So in the Mediterranean, in Europe, for example, there's an increasing occurrence of wildfires during the dry summer seasons. There's increasing droughts in many parts of the world. There was this very devastating floods in this country, unfortunately, in 2022, but we also don't have to go back so far. Just the last days, there were, again, very heavy floods in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan that, again, displaced thousands, and unfortunately also several hundred people lost their lives. So what this all just underlines is that the intensity and frequency goes up, and with that, of course, the question, how do we as human society adapt and how do we react? How can we live in a world that has more and more of these environmental hazards? And so a couple of the research questions that we try to address with the project that I'll introduce in a minute is, on the one hand, how do different types of environmental events affect mobility differently? Because you can imagine that a flood might have different impacts than a drought or a fire, because they have different nature in how they impact the communities. Then one of the most contested questions in the field is the question, how many people will actually move and where will they go? So this is, of course, a very political question. On the one hand, in the international sphere, so how many people will move across borders? But then, of course, also within countries, it's very relevant for policymakers to understand how many people will, for example, move into the cities so that we can prepare infrastructures and also the welcoming culture ideally. But then also on the individual level, it's so far not well understood how do individuals even make migration decisions. So this is a psychological process where we weigh different costs and benefits of moving. And so what is the role of environmental changes in this decision-making process is also not so straightforward. And then the last aspect we try to add some evidence to the field is the question of trapped populations. So this is a term that's also very widely used politically to describe communities that maybe would want to move out of a hazard zone, but that don't have the means to do so because maybe the environmental impacts already degraded their resources, and so they can't move. So these are just some aspects that we try to address with the research design, which I'll introduce in a minute. And then the overarching question is just broadly, how does environmental change impact both mobility and immobility? I think this is a first important note here, that we are not only looking at the people who move, but likewise at the people who stay, because they, of course, also have often very difficult situations that they are facing. And so it's highly policy relevant also to understand how can we support these communities. So I don't want to go too much into the theory, but just to briefly outline the conceptual and theoretical model that we apply. So what we try to link is, on the left side, the environmental changes that occur, and then on the right side, the decision to go or to stay. So this is the big question that we try to understand. At what point does a household decide, now I start moving? And so to connect these two, on the first step, we need to look at the perception of exposure. And this, I think, is also one important methodological aspect that we always stress, that we don't look at objective exposure. So it's maybe less important how much does the temperature rise on the thermometer, but it's more important how do people perceive it. I think we can all relate to that. In the end, we have a perception when we go outside. How hot is it? How are the rains? And so it's in the end, as we're talking about a psychological process, it's important how people perceive the environmental changes. And then the next step that we look at is, if the community and the household perceives environmental changes, they might form what we call migration aspirations. So this is a desire to move. So when you feel the environment is getting more and more hostile, maybe at some point you start thinking, maybe it's a better idea to move somewhere else. So this is called migration aspirations. It's not yet an actual move. It's just something that happens in our mind where we think, okay, I would like to move away. But then secondly, what we of course also need to consider is what's called the capability to move. So whether people actually can also undertake the move, because maybe some of you also moved to Karachi from other parts of the country. It takes a certain amount of resources to move, both just the pure, let's say, monetary resources to buy a ticket and to do the moving expenses. But of course, also psychologically, if we're in a new place, it's an unfamiliar environment. Maybe we are separate from our family. So there's a psychological cost. We might need some network to move that supports us. So there are some aspects that are summarized as capability to move. And these are, of course, also, again, conditioned by factors that I maybe don't go into the details here, but what, for example, the IPCC calls sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So these are two factors that just underline that different households also will be able to cope with the same environmental shock differently. So if I have a rich household who maybe has a lot of resources, then they have a certain buffer capacity. If they lose one plot of land, maybe they have 2 or 3 others and they can still continue farming. But if a household just has one plot of land and they lose it, then basically they have nothing left. So this is what's described by these terms, sensitivity and adaptive capacity, that we of course also need to look at differences between households to understand the formation of these two constructs, migration aspirations and capability to move. And now why we look at these two is because that's, let's say, the central theory in migration studies. It's called the aspirations capability theory. So these are the two factors that we need to look at to understand whether people go or stay. So if a person has both the aspirations to move and also the capability, then we would expect that person will undertake a move. So they want to move and they can, so they go. But then if one of the two is missing, so either they don't want to go or they don't have the means to, then we expect them to stay. And I will talk more about this in a minute also when I talk about the specific chapters of my dissertation. But this is, I think, the central model is aspirations and capabilities, which in the end, not only for migration studies, but general in psychology is two important constructs that help to explain human behavior. And to make it a little bit more complicated, that of course, all of this is not happening in a vacuum of one household, but a household lives in a community lives in a district and in a national system and also an international one. So we, of course, also have an institutional context that we need to look at. Very basic, for example, on the international front, we have borders that limit mobility. But there's other, of course, policy measures that can either support migration or try to reduce it. So this is maybe a lot of information on one slide, but I think it's still important to understand a bit the background of the papers that I will introduce in a minute briefly. So then a few words about the case that we studied is Bangladesh. I guess most of you are also familiar that it's one of the most climate vulnerable countries on Earth. Actually, it's affected by a whole range of climatic and environmental impacts. So on the coast, that's the most affected and most studied area. They have an increase in cyclones and salinity through the rising sea levels that push basically salt water into the aquifers. But we actually look at an inland river system, the Jamuna, that I'll introduce in a minute in more detail, where there's widespread riverbank erosion and flooding during the monsoon each year. And then at the same time, Bangladesh is also a country that has historically seen a large, let's say, degree of internal migration. So there's frequent labor migration seasonally and temporarily. And in projections, for example, by the World Bank, it's also expected that several million people will move due to environmental changes within the country by 2050. So these are a bit the two reasons that on the one hand, it's very climate exposed, and on the other hand, it's a country that has a history of mobility that we believe makes it a good case study to look at the interaction of climate change and migration. So just to say a few words about the erosion that we observed, it's something that at least from the Central European context, we are not familiar with the extent of erosion that's occurring along the Jamuna, because it's really entire chunks of soil that get washed away with the water during the monsoon. As the soil is very sandy, it doesn't have a lot of resistance to the power of the water. So whenever there's more water coming in June, July, then these entire chunks of soil basically break into the river. And I thought it would be nice to give some more visual impressions before I go into the more specific scientific findings. So we made a short documentary also of 25 minutes. I just wanted to show the first 3 just to give an impression. Let me just pull that up of what the communities look like that we studied.
Around the globe, environmental changes threaten the livelihood of millions. Events such as floods, storms, or rising sea levels can displace thousands. What does that mean for the future? Will climate change lead to massive migration flows? Actually, many questions about climate-induced migration are still open. A team of researchers from ETH Zurich and different universities in Bangladesh investigates the causal link between environmental changes and migration. The group of researchers goes into the field and visits many different villages in Bangladesh, one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. In the villages, they ask the locals how they perceive their environment.
ছোটবেলা থেকে আমার বাড়ি ভাঙছে লেখা 9 বারের মতো
শুধু সম্পদই নেই নদী একটা ভ্রাতৃত্ব বন্ধন একটা ভাই ভাইয়ের একটা সম্পর্ক সেই সম্পর্কটাও বিচ্ছিন্ন হয়ে গেছে নদী ভাঙার কারণে
अस्सलामु अलैकुम नाज़रीन रात 9
Jamuna River, carving its way through the land of Bangladesh. With a total length of 250 kilometers, it is a great resource that provides for many communities along its riverbanks. The river provides fertile land to grow rice, is abundant in fish, and the river is a way to transport goods and people. During dry season, a peaceful and calm environment where nature, humans and animals live in coexistence. But this is not the whole story. The river has its own character, sliding its way through the countryside. eroding the land along the riverbank. Each year, during the rainy season, the river swells and picks up speed. Chunks of soil break into the river and get washed away. This leads to a loss of farming land. Many people also lose their houses. In some cases, entire villages are swept away in just a few weeks. This forces people to shift their houses within the village. Some also migrate to other places, leaving their beloved village behind. Erosion and migration dominate the local discussions. One of the villages along the Jamuna is Char Pauli. During the monsoon of 2022, more than 300 meters of land broke into the river, destroying many houses.
ওই যে লোকেরা জায়গা যাচ্ছে ওইখানে আমার বাড়ি ছিল বাড়িটা ভাঙা চলে গেছে আমাদের নদী অঞ্চল এলাকা যারা লোকজন থাকি আমরা তাদের খুব কষ্ট বাড়ি ভাঙা নিয়ে টানে নেওয়া বা আবার মাটি ফেলা তোলা আবার সেই বাড়ি ভাঙা যায় আমাদের জন্য খুব কষ্ট লাগে এই যমুনা নদী আমাদের মনে করেন যে সর্বনাশের মূল
This is Abdul, who used to live on his father's land.
Just wanted to show the first few minutes to give some impression. I'll also share the link later on. It's freely available on YouTube. So if you want to have a closer look, you can look at the full movie at any time. So let's continue for now, but I thought it's a nice impression to get a feeling for the setting in which we conducted the study. So a few words about the research design that we applied. So again, we worked along the Jamuna River, which is one of the three main streams of Bangladesh coming in from the Indian side, from Assam, where we selected 36 different villages, shown with the red dots on the second panel here, basically from the border with India down to the confluence with the Ganges River. And in these villages, we selected about 2,200 respondents. So also there we applied a spatial selection strategy to interview households who live at different distances from the riverbank to capture different risk levels. Because of course, the closer you live to the riverbank, the higher the risk is to get affected by erosion in the next monsoon season. So we interviewed these 2,200 people in 2021 for the first time, so before the monsoon, and then we came back 3 times after the monsoon, so in January, February of 2022, 2023, and 2024. That's always the dry season, so then we return to the villages and we try to understand who was affected by erosion and who has left. So these are the 2 main aspects that we investigated. So in total, we collected around 24,000 surveys over these 3 years, which also actually just a month ago, we managed to publish all the data open access. So this is a QR code to the data set if anyone is interested to work with it. We also wrote a paper to describe the data set to make the work with it easier. So all of this will soon be open access, but you can also email me afterwards if you can't find the data or if you have questions about it. But we're always happy, of course, if more people use it because it was a lot of work to collect it. So the more it gets used, the better. So this is a short overview of the data set that we constructed. So I just wanted to highlight now 3 different aspects that we investigated. We look at many different sub-questions, but the first paper that is one part of my dissertation also is the relationship between environmental shocks and migration. The second one looks at the immobility part, so those who stay. And then the third one, it's a new project that we're currently working on, where we look at how does it affect communities if they get affected repeatedly. So a few words on the first paper. I'll just keep these rather short to give an idea of what we are looking at, because I want to save more time also for the discussion afterwards. So this has been published last year. Again, with the QR code, you can access the full paper in open access. So what we try to understand in this paper is how does environmental stress affect migration behavior? So you remember this was the arm where both aspirations and the capability to move are present. So here we now focus only on the mobility aspect. And as I mentioned briefly in the introduction, that we expect different types of environmental events to have different impacts. So if we, for example, look at floods, these are usually coming very suddenly, but then they also stay maybe just a few weeks, or in worst case, maybe a few months. But then usually the damages that occur are reversible. If it's, let's say, a normal flood, like in the Bangladesh context, where each year during the monsoon, the communities are exposed to flooding, then this is something that they have found ways to live with. So we would expect that people maybe move away short term for some weeks when the water is there, but then to come back after to rebuild and continue the life in the village. But if we now look at, for example, erosion or other factors that are more gradual, long-term, so you can also think of droughts, of salinity increases. These are changes that come very gradually over years. And so maybe for a long time, you can still adapt, for example, by irrigating your agricultural plot or pursuing other adaptation strategies. But then these changes in some sense are irreversible. So if the soil is very saline, at some point it's difficult to grow crops anymore. I mean, I'm putting that in brackets because most things in some way are reversible, but at least in the short run, it's nothing that you can easily desalinate your soil as a farmer. So in these cases, if households are confronted with such changes, we expect then the mobility to occur later, but then when it occurs to be more permanent, because there's not much you can still do in your environment. So then we expect people to rather pack their things and move to an area that provides better livelihood options. So the data that I use in this paper is actually just using the first monsoon season, so the before and after monsoon data. I maybe, just for time reasons, also skip over the exact statistical findings that you can find in the paper and directly go to the summary and the implications. So what we find is that the erosion, that has a very strong influence on the migration likelihood. So households that were affected by erosion, they are much more likely to move, whereas with the floods, we see almost no effect, or it's basically statistically insignificant. And I think that also makes sense because the communities there, they have found ways to adapt to the flooding. They raise their houses, they maybe move temporarily to another inland location for a few weeks and then come back. Whereas with the erosion, it's very difficult to adapt because it's really the entire housing that goes away, the entire agricultural land. So what we find is that it's really very much driven by the specific type of impacts that the household experiences, which also I think makes sense that in the end, it's very, very important whether you lose your house or whether you just have some damages that you can repair. So it's really the severity of the impact that drives the migration outcomes. And then we also look at where do people go. So in the data collection, we also followed migrants. So if they left the village, we basically had their phone number and we called them and we traced them if they went to a city or to another village. So what we observe is that the erosion that really leads to permanent moves and interestingly also a lot of moves within the rural context. So I think intuitively, we always think of migration, everyone goes to cities, which I think is also partly true. But in this context, people have very strong ties to the rural context, actually, and they don't want to go to cities because they say it's too hectic, too stressful, and they prefer the rural life where they have their social connections. And yeah, it's a different way of living that they actually prefer. But then what we also find is that households who struggle with low socioeconomic status, so low income, low wealth, there we observe temporary moves to cities, which is, I think, what many societies have developed in the form of temporary labor migration. So what are the implications of this? On the one hand, we already found that just looking at this one monsoon season, a lot of people move. So if you now extrapolate this to the whole of Bangladesh and to many monsoon seasons, we can indeed get a feeling that these increasing erosion patterns will lead to a lot of movement within Bangladesh. But then these permanent moves that we see, it's nothing that people prefer. It's more seen as a permanent, as a last resort. So they try to stay in the village as long as they can. And only if the adaptation fails, then they will move elsewhere. The moves are mostly short distance that I will also show in a minute, which is very interesting. And we also see that even in this scenario where we have very extreme environmental impacts, most people still prefer to stay. And that's very interesting because when we started the project, we thought, okay, this is a region that's so exposed to environmental changes, probably everyone will try to move out and go somewhere else. But actually, it's the opposite, that people have these very strong social ties to their relatives, to their communities, that they really want to stay as long as possible. And only if that's not possible anymore, because the environment changes too much, then they decide to move. So that, I think, directly connects to the second chapter of my dissertation that looks more at the immobility side. So again, this came out last year in Regional Environmental Change. So a big discussion, as I mentioned initially, is the question of when people stay in environmental exposed areas, are they doing so voluntarily or involuntarily? Because very quickly we put that notion of, if people stay in such a region, it's probably involuntarily, they want to move, but they can't. But there is, of course, also people who prefer staying, as I just mentioned. And we try to understand how do these groups compare to each other. So as mentioned, now we look at the lower branch. So if either aspirations or the capability to move is missing, then we expect the immobility. And then, of course, theoretically, why this is now interesting is because the environmental shocks, on the one hand, we can expect them to increase aspirations. So if there's more and more impacts of the environment, if there's more and more heat waves, etc., we would expect at some point people to say, maybe this is not a good place anymore to live. I want to move somewhere else. But at the same time, these exact same environmental shocks can also reduce your capability to move. So if you think of that case of erosion in the villages that we investigated, they have very drastic economic impacts. People really lose their farmland, they lose their house, then they have to take a loan to rebuild or to lease land somewhere else. So this interplay of, on the one hand, the environmental shocks increase your aspirations, but they might also decrease your capability to move. This can then really lead to the situation of what's called trapped populations, that people would want to go, but they can't anymore. So basically using the same data, what we now find is that around 4% of our respondents in this one monsoon season, they left the village. So this is voluntary mobility. But then around 13%, they are now classified as involuntary immobility. So this is the case where people have high aspirations, so they would want to go, but they can't. So this is just 13%, whereas then the two categories at the bottom, which I don't go into the differentiation too much because it's a detail that's maybe not so relevant here. They together are 83% of the respondents. So these are people who stay in the village, but they actually also prefer staying. So this, I think, is very interesting, that we would expect, if people stay, then actually it's just because they can't leave, but they would want to leave. But no, we find the opposite, that actually 80% of those who stay, they are also preferring to stay. So there's really this very strong rootedness in the locations where people live. Yes, so again, just briefly about the summary. So most of those who do not move actually qualify as voluntary non-migrants, as I just explained. But then what we also find is that those 13% that I showed of involuntary non-migrants, they indeed do have a lower socioeconomic status than the voluntary ones. So we find a bit that what we expected theoretically, that the repeated environmental shocks indeed decrease the wealth of respondents. And so we might indeed have some trapped populations, but they're not as many as we expected previously. And so what does this imply now for a policy perspective? I think one of the key takeaways also for me from this entire research project is that we really need to understand people's aspirations. So we need to talk to them and understand, do they want to go or do they want to stay? Because in the end, this is a very crucial distinction. If someone wants to move out, then as a policymaker, I need to support them in reducing migration barriers. But if they want to stay, then I need to support them in surviving in situ as well as possible. And of course, there's limits to this. I mean, if people stay in very high risk areas, at some point the government won't be able anymore to afford the support. But in general, I think this distinction is still important because it might sound simple, but in practice, it just very frequently, it's not happening. So governments take decisions without consulting the communities. And then, yeah, I think often that leads to maladaptive policies because it's not aligned with what the communities actually want themselves. So now just briefly at the last chapter. So what we try to understand here is so far we only looked at one monsoon season in these two chapters that I showed, and actually much of the literature on climate mobility also just looks at one event. So for example, looking at the 2022 flood in Pakistan, how much displacement did this cause? But now what I showed in the very first slide is that climate change, of course, leads to an increase in the frequency of environmental shocks. So households in many regions of the world, they are repeatedly affected, maybe year after year or 2 years out of 5 years. So that scenario of just having one shock and then never another shock, that's actually very rare. For many households, either they have even 2 or 3 shocks in 1 year, or then several after each other. And so this is, of course, one aspect that we can now look at with this data set because we followed the same people for 3 years. So we cover 3 monsoon seasons. So this is the main research question here. How do floods and erosion that occur either in the same year or several years in a row affect mobility? So again, we look at the mobility branch for this paper, but now we use the entire data set. So really, covering all 3 monsoon seasons. And so what we can then do is basically just calculate how many times a household has been affected by erosion in these 3 years. And then you see this goes up to 3 times. And of course, we might now wonder, how can it be that households are affected 3 times in a row? So this is what I wanted to show just briefly on a satellite image of one of our study villages in the southern part, close to Dhaka. So what we see here is the scenario at the beginning of our study. On the left, the Jamuna River, on the right, land. And then in yellow, these are the locations of our survey respondents. So the GPS coordinates of their households at the beginning of the study in 2021. So now we jump 1 year into January 2022 and have an updated satellite image. So what we see is now in turquoise, the line is that the river basically eroded around 200 meters of land in this one monsoon season. So the yellow dots that you see now that are in the water, so these are all households that basically lost the land on which their house was standing within this 1 year. And then we trace them. So these are now the turquoise dots to see where did they go. And we see many of them, they actually shift just a few hundred meters inland. We also see some, of course, that leave the image. So those are those that really move further, maybe to the city. But most of these, they stay in the village and just relocate by a couple hundred meters. Now we jump 1 more year and we see again around 200 meters of erosion and some of the turquoise dots. So these are yellow dots that shifted by the first year. They again got eroded. So then we already see that there are some houses here that got affected 2 times in a row. And we add 1 more year. This is the last study year. And we see some of the red dots again got affected. So this shows that we have indeed cases where houses or households lost their plot of land 3 years in a row, which is very drastic. You can just imagine losing your house once is already like inconceivable in terms of also the psychological distress. But then going through this cycle year after year, it's, yeah, I think for me, it's inconceivable how the households cope with that. But then so this is just the illustration of that we do indeed have these cases where households got affected 3 times in a row. And then we look at this from a more statistical point of view. And what we see, again, I don't go into the details of the statistical modeling. This is then in the paper when it's out. Currently, this is still working paper. But what we see is interesting that erosion affectedness, if it happens once, so this is the upper field here, if households get affected by erosion once, then this has a very significant impact on the migration likelihood. But if they get affected 2 or 3 times, then we see a decrease in the likelihood. And the same pattern for flooding on the lower end. So the more times people are affected by flooding, the lower their migration likelihood. So the pattern that we observe here is that increasing effects, they lower migration likelihood, which I think is interesting because you could also argue the other way around, that if it happens again and again, at some point people leave. But probably this is then an indicator of that these repeated effects deplete the resources that would be necessary to move. And so then over time, people get stuck if they get repeatedly affected. But again, this is work in progress. So for now, this is preliminary findings. So this was a bit the main aspects that I wanted to show. We also have a number of other projects currently running because it's a huge data set. So I just wanted to highlight that we look at different aspects also. Some, for example, focus more specifically on gender and youth aspects, some focusing more on the migration outcomes, some more on subjective well-being, etc. So also just to illustrate the types of topical areas that we have in the data set. And again, just an invitation to use it and to reach out if you're interested in any part of it. So some takeaways from now my dissertation and the project in general. So on the one hand, we find that yes, environmental changes can lead to migration. So we observed a strong effect of erosion on migration, but at the same time, they can of course also trap populations in place if they at some point can't move out anymore. Then this framework that I introduced in the beginning, aspirations, capabilities framework, this has actually become, for me, a very interesting framework in general to understand human behavior. So I think just looking at these two sides of what do people want and what can they do, yeah, I find it very helpful to understand what we observe in community responses to climate change. And then lastly, I think this is an important finding also that goes in line with much of the literature or almost all the literature on climate migration, is that the mobility that we observe, it's almost exclusively within Bangladesh. So we do have some people who moved outside the country from our 2,200 respondents, but this is the classical labor migration, for example, to the Middle East, to Malaysia, what I think also is a huge area for labor migration in Pakistan. So these are not classical environmental migrants. So these are labor migrants, but those who move because of the environmental changes, they actually stay within the country. Yes, so this is just a short shout out to our huge team in Bangladesh. We worked with about 70 students over these 4 years who walked many miles to collect this data and to find the migrants. So this is always a moment where I want to say a big thank you. We had to reach some of the villages by boat because they are very remote. So there was a huge effort here to collect this data. So many thanks to our team. This is again the links to both the documentary that's really available on YouTube, and we also made a photo book that unfortunately is not open access, but with a publishing house in Zurich. But if you want to have a look at the demo, you can also find the link here. And I'm also happy to share the slides later if you don't have the time now to scan it. But now so this was a bit the summary of the Bangladesh study. I think what I would now really like to do for the discussion is to understand your perspectives of how does this now look like for the Bangladesh for the case of Pakistan. So what are maybe dynamics that are similar and where are differences? So, and I just have some thoughts here as discussion starters, but then looking forward to your ideas. So on the one hand, of course, we look at this river system that has a lot of erosion, the Jamuna, which I think is very unique in the extent that it erodes. So not many countries in the world have such a river system. But of course, the Indus and tributaries also erode a lot of land each year in Sindh and KP. So what does that mean then, for example, for For these households, do you expect similar dynamics, or maybe some of you have also worked in these areas? Did you observe similar mobility dynamics? Then one aspect that I didn't mention here, but it's also interesting, it's like the first chapter of my dissertation, I looked at perceptions of environmental changes. So how do the communities even perceive, on the one hand, climate change, but also the erosion? And what I found is that on the one hand, they very much overestimate erosion extents, but this is more, I think, a numerical estimation problem. But they have a very clear feeling that the climate is changing. So they all say it's getting hotter, the rainfall is getting more erratic, the monsoon seasons are getting more erratic. And that's, of course, interesting because then, yeah, these are communities that have in the elder generation very low educational attainment. So this is not something that they learned in school, but it's really, I think, an interesting finding that it's something that they feel in their everyday work with nature, because they're, of course, very dependent also through the agriculture. Then I think one core distinction that we make in all the papers is that we need to look at the type of events. So flooding has different effects from erosion, and yet again, droughts will have different effects, etc. So, and what we found then was that in these communities, they really have these ways of living with flood water that they developed over centuries. But that, of course, doesn't necessarily travel to other contexts. So, for example, in Pakistan, would you say that it's a similar aspect for different communities that live directly along the Indus, for example, that they have found ways, or is it different if they get, quote unquote, surprised by flooding? Then, of course, one huge problem in the whole migration study field is a large data gap, essentially. So this data set that we constructed is one of the few of its kind that really follows people over years, because it's very costly and it's very labor intensive. I mean, I showed part of our team. It was a huge challenge to actually find the migrants, to track them, to establish the relationships. And that means that there is very limited data of that fine-grained nature. And so I think for Pakistan, for example, right now there's, and for most countries, there's no such longitudinal data set available. But of course, it, I think, would be very helpful to establish similar data products also for Pakistan. Then one aspect that would be interesting to discuss is, of course, the policy lens. So what can Pakistani policymakers now do? Should they focus more on supporting mobility so that people can move out of affected areas? Or should they try to support those who want to stay in situ? Because this is, of course, also a challenging aspect that you can't keep investing. I think we have the discussion now also in Switzerland that certain of the mountainous areas, they get more and more affected by landslides. There was a huge incident a year ago where an entire village was destroyed by a landslide that's caused by the melting of the glaciers. And then this sparked a huge discussion of should we rebuild this village or not, because it's very costly to rebuild and to protect villages that maybe just have 50 houses and to build all the engineering. So that's, I think, a discussion that more and more countries will have in the future. Up to which point can we keep investing in erosion or in exposed areas? And at what point do we need to basically move people out of these affected zones? And so, yeah, just in general, the last point, I think, how much of these findings you think travel now to Pakistan? So, of course, there are also diverse slow onset changes that we observe in different regions. Drought, of course, you also have maybe salinity problems in the coastal zones. So, yeah, I think these are just some discussion starters, but in general, I'm very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts, as I'm also always, trying to expand my network and see potential future collaboration. So, yeah, just very curious to hear what you think, and many thanks again for the invitation and for attending in such large number. Thank you. Please. Guten Tag.
And before that, there is that operating that. So, as you mentioned about the perception and the reality of the climate change, and data gone through any studies regarding these aspects such as so that we can really observe any kind of failure of something, any type of third or any type of climate change?
So whether I have come across any similar studies, you mean, for Pakistan context? Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, unfortunately, I think, as mentioned, there's not many of such data sets in general. So I'm not aware of one for the Pakistan case. Yeah. Yeah. So no, I think that's something that I also didn't yet prepare for, because I came here mainly for the air pollution research right now. So that's a bit always the confusing part, that there's these two big research fields, and I'm at the moment more focused on the literature on air pollution in the Pakistan context. But yeah, if anybody's interested in working in these questions, then I would suggest please reach out. I'm not sure if my email is somewhere, but we can share the email ID also afterwards. So I'm very happy to exchange and see if there's any scope for future work. Yeah.
In Pakistan, the climate change and what we need resilience.
Yeah.
How to mitigate those effects. So recently there was a conference in Narayana University a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of studies were there. One of my topics was also that one.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. Climate change and environmental resilience, challenges and strategies.
Yeah, perfect. That would be interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor, for your very nice informative lecture. I'm Suhail Yusuf, science journalist from Express Tribune. I have just write two news about the climatic changes in Pakistan. First is the effect of climate change on child spending. It is done by Aga Khan University and Dr. Gulfiqar Gupta team. The second is a very beautiful highway when you go to Naran Kahan, it is called N95. From past 15 years, the landslide has increased due to climatic changes. It is confirmed by the field reports and the climate extremes data. So thank you so much. Your valuable research can be replicated in Pakistan. As far as I observed something. I have observed the double migration in Pakistan. And similarly, if you took aside the other side in Balochistan, within the span of 1 or 2 years, the whole village engulfed by the sand dunes. They have drought problem as well. So I'm here. I can connect you, the climate scientists, and as a journalist, I can help you in any aspect you want to research. Thank you so much.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Very nice, very visual presentation. First of all, what I am interested, have you investigated the temporal data? It means because you are talking about erosion, what happened before, for example, 1 decade before, has this level of Jamuna risen so far? Or it is the first time that it has happened that this level is too high to go on this side. So this is the first thing. But I'm curious. For Pakistan, we have carried out many studies in our institute for the sea level rise and coastal bleach, because many coastal land we are losing each year to the sea because of climate change. And with regard to Pakistan, we have also seen that many settlements have been shifted near the sea. river, and near the Indus River or Ravi River in previous decade. And we are talking a lot these days on report. And we know that waterways, sooner or later, they are recovered by the river water. So this is also, I think, observable and noticeable in Pakistan because they are not shifting because when because the result of Indus water building, many rivers were out of water and many shifting has been placed in the waterways. But no, the people are also migrating backward to their living place.
So you mean that the water level decreased and so people move into areas that previously were a river? Yeah. So I think it's a bit the opposite dynamic. Just a brief comment on the first part about the temporal dimension. So we also looked at satellite imagery to understand the erosion history for the past 10 years. So this is the time span of the data product we used. So this is a region that has seen erosion for many decades also. So what we showed here is not the first year that erosion occurs, but it's shifting along the river. So some villages, maybe they are affected. They are not affected for 10 years and then the erosion starts and then it occurs for 3, 4, 5 years and then it moves on. So it's really a very dynamic river system in that sense, also very interesting just from a natural scientific point of view. But it's not in that sense a novel phenomenon. That's also what I try to underline always. This is not now a new phenomenon of climate change. This erosion has been ongoing since the 60s, 70s in this region, but we still look at it as a proxy, for example, for coastal erosion, because the process is the same. So people lose their house, they lose their land. So the mechanism is similar to what happens in coastal regions where maybe also the rise in tides affects communities in similar ways. So just to clarify, we don't claim this to be primarily or only climate change effects, but we speak about environmental changes and then try to understand how the communities adapt. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. So,
here, yeah, perfect.
First, I will thank you for the very interesting topic. Not only that migration due to climate change, but you also tried aspect of immobility. So, in one part, you make a distinction: voluntary migrants and voluntary migrants, non-migrants, and involuntarily non-migrants. So they share the same communities and they share the same economic background. So how do you distinguish between them? Because I don't think there is a data to, or how you spot that your distinction between these two types of non-migrants.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question because it's actually in practice not so easy. So, but in the end, what we did, we asked people whether they would want to move out or not. So it's again, most of the data that I showed is survey based. So really talking to the respondents. And then we see that maybe 20% they say, yeah, actually I would like to move, but now I'm still here. But the others, they say, no, I prefer staying here. So this is based on their own assessment. Yeah.
Thanks really for citing and how we climate change. Every year we see this climate change and lots of lives and some other problems. But we don't have to look about it. What's the next solution?
Yeah, I think very good question. Of course, this whole presentation now was about more the adaptation side, but that's of course not the way forward. So of course we need to adapt to what's happening, but in the end, the main focus, of course, has to be on mitigation. So reducing emissions as much as possible, because there's just, I think, very clear now with the modeling that every plus 0.1 degree that we increase, the effects just go up, not linearly, but exponentially at some point. So I think primary focus should still be on mitigation. I'm not sure, was that your question? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think, again, this is not so much my focus in general, but it's I think there's a lot of research scope on the mitigation side, yeah, also of how to use nature-based solutions, microbiology. So I assume this is also something that the institute here is working on, which I think is is a key and crucial research for the future, because every CO2 ton that we don't emit is something that we then don't have to adapt to later on. So I think that's the key message with all of this research. It's always a bit maybe misleading that we now get into this fatalism of we just need to adapt. It's still a race to reduce CO2 as much as possible. And then we need to adapt to what's happening. But the focus should still be primarily on the reduction of CO2. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
I have also done my research on climate change implications on the resources of sin.
Yeah.
So these phenomena are very common and natural. Actually, the river has to flow, like the flood is natural. The flooding is unnatural, that has to be mitigated and controlled. The most important thing here in Pakistan we see is the human behavior, which is nearly impossible to change. Like, for example, the river is flowing. When we ask people not to live, what is the policy? We make the policy that these areas are not allowed, basically, for any type of constructions. In Pakistan, northern areas of Pakistan, I have personally witnessed lots of natural resources degradation.
Yeah.
Many people are living there, but they should not be allowed to live there. So policy making decision makers are very important in this case. Like, for example, in Pakistan, when we decide to construct a dam reservoir, people are not ready to leave their areas. But in case of the Villa Dam, their planned migration was done by the government in order to provide them the compensation and jobs. Planned migration was done to get jobs and land some other areas. The same case in Kalaka plant. People are not ready to leave their area.
Yeah.
So the human behavior and psychology, I want to say that the psychology and the doctors and the psychologists are also very important to visit, to train them, to guide them, because they are very much associated with their areas.
Yeah.
They are not easily, leave those areas, but their forefathers have been living.
No, fully agree. I mean, thanks for this very important.
Taking care of the research.
Yeah.
Even behavior and psychology. How to work on it on a ground root level or at the grassroots level.
No, I think
motivate them.
This is a pattern that many countries observe. I mean, also the US has huge problems with coastal erosion, with wildfires and other aspects, and they are since many years already working on planned relocations, but they're facing the exact same issues that people want to stay. So it's a politically very difficult process, I think, in all countries that are working on it. And I think the answer, again, is a bit the same conclusion as the other points I mentioned before, that in the end, I think there's no way around working with the communities. And if this decision is taken in Islamabad that a certain region needs to be evacuated, but no one's speaking to the communities, I think it's very likely that there will be backlash and people don't want to leave. So I don't say that working with communities will solve all problems, but I think without it, it's quite unlikely that there's a good solution. So yeah, I think that would be my answer, that still you need to take the effort of going outside and going to where people live and talking to them, even if it's a remote area. That would be my answer, but well taken point. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
These water, the rivers have been flowing for centuries, millions of years. Yeah. But the river you mentioned, similarly in Pakistan, this is a phenomenon is that in our neighboring country, they are overflowing the water.
Yeah.
It's spillover.
Yeah.
Now that spillover is a political angle, which is causing more damage, which has never happened earlier, which is now happening. So one of my questions, do we have some international laws relating to this spillovers, which is causing damage to the whole communities? And it's split psychological, as the man mentioned, but it's a community interaction. The integration of the communities, that is actually bound with people.
together, even with all threats. So this is one area I want to ask. Secondly, one of our colleagues also pointed out that there is there is a house of communities. You know, they are building on the waterways. Now that is again a critical issue. How come governments? I have no idea what the case which you have mentioned.
Yeah.
But in Pakistan, there is a huge urbanization and migration near the waterways. The third thing is basically which is important to understand is that there is a political dimension of how you are channeling the water, the flood water. There have been cases with people who are more powerful as feudals. They divert the water in those areas which are poor, which are already have no power, and the damage is more for the poor, not for the powerful elites. And last thing, I really want to just add, I've been working with some of the DRGs in not here, but in GB.
Yeah.
There is also one phenomenon which is the glacial melt.
Yeah.
The glacial bursts.
The cloth for it. Yeah.
I can give you one example. I was in Pasu in GB.
Yeah.
And there's a glacier.
Observe the equal form and because the factory is ready for it.
Sure. So I'm just ending. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Now, please.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jan, for your insightful lecture. I really enjoyed the lecture and came to know about so many things. I can really correlate with the idea of trapped population because I have seen some population in Pakistan who are still living in high-risk areas and who do not want to leave their space sometimes because of some economic pressures and some social dynamics. So I can really correlate with that. And I feel that much of the literature suggests that migration-related decisions are multi-causal. So environmental stress is closely related to economic indicators and social dynamics as well. So the lecture was really so interesting. So I'm really thankful to you for your lecture, and I'm also thankful to so many people who came here immediately on short notice. For example, I would like to thank Dr. Farooq, Director of Institute of Environmental Science, and I would also like to thank Dr. Lubna Fazal, and she is also from the Department of Geography. And I would also like to thank Professor Nadeem, who has helped me a lot in arranging this session on such short notice. And obviously, I cannot forget the name of Dr. Zulfikar, who has supported me throughout in arranging all this lecture, and Sir Khalid for arranging all this logistics and everything. And I would like to thank Dr. Nabil Zubair, who is the chairperson of Sociology Department. So thank you so much, all faculty members. And obviously, thank you so much to my dear students and the faculty persons and the journalists who are sitting here. Thank you so much for being here. And hopefully, we will have these kind of lectures in near future as well. Thank you.